I have so many thoughts and I can't wrap my head around them all. Okay, let's try to do this. We're gonna do this in one take. We're just gonna do this. So Monday this week, Canada Soccer put out a tweet with Bev Priestman, who her record in the last 2 years, and with their new release roster, she has a record of 17 wins, 10 draws, and 5 losses. She has 50 cap invitees and 38 have played a match. We congratulate Bev on 2 years playing. But then I ask the question, how do we feel about this? Is this good? Is this bad? And there's lots of layers to this conversation, but for the most part, everyone's feeling pretty good about this. For the most part, right? There's some people who will look at it and say, maybe she needs to grow a bit more, but 50 players, the one comment where I kind of do agree with is good, but 50 should have gotten minutes, not just 38. And that's the thing with this stat. 30 have gotten minutes, but minutes can include coming into the game with 3 minutes, and that's all you get. Which is a bit problematic. Try to research a little bit more into that, but there are players like a Mary Yasmin Alidou who's played 45 minutes in 3 invitees, where she's on the bench at the Arnold Clark Cup and only plays against Spain, and then she's on the bench against the Korea matchup. There's a lot to dissect in terms of the 50 invitees and the 38, and especially when you factor in a few days later, on the Wednesday, so November 2nd, when Canadian-born Kelsey Araujo was called up by the Portuguese national team to be on their senior team, and if she does play in a competitive match, that will essentially stop her journey for the time being. I mean, we're assuming the 3 years, but I mean, at this point, young player, she's probably there, and it's had me have this conversation where I'm really wondering, why don't we see more? Now, it's a bit of a loaded conversation, and I've had this conversation with friends. You're going to hear the word conversation a lot, because apparently that's how I communicate conversations. But if you're Bev, and there's one way, and I always ask myself this, is our program this deep that we've only played 38 players in 2 years? I understand the notion of chemistry, of wanting to build that, but when you're honestly honest, when you're a little bit honest with it, Bev has seen most of these players as she was a U20 coach before she took over the national team. So with that being the case, she has seen the majority of these players, and pretty much there's a thought that I have where if you've played youth football for this country, you're essentially guaranteed yourself minimum 3 call-ups, regardless of different times. And that's both good and a little bit frustrating, because if you don't come through that pipeline, it is a little bit more difficult to break it in. If you look at the national team that was just brought up, only 3 players on that team didn't play any type of youth football for Canada. And those would be Vanessa Gilles, who started off playing for France, but then switched over to Canada afterwards. You have Chloe Lacasse, who was nearly switched to Iceland, but wasn't able to do that, and then got called up for Canada. And then Evelyn Vienne, who didn't go through the National Development Centers, went overseas after playing in the NWSL, has been tearing it up in her league, but then took a while to come through. Those are your only 3. Everyone else on this roster has played some sort of youth level for Canada. Now, I'm not asking necessarily that we need to see more non-developmental players, non-National Development Center players. But to a degree, it's how are you going to see the full pool if you're only calling up so many players? I think if you look at that perspective, and I think a fair argument that's made is, well, the Federation only gives you so many camps, which is fair. If you only have 6 camps that you're going to have a year, you want to maximize them as much as possible. There's no doubt about that. However, when you're looking at, when you're literally looking at players, now we don't know if they've reached out to Kelsey Araujo. If they did, and they didn't, and she didn't want to come through, that's a different conversation. But right, it's the unknown which kind of kills it. But Canada hasn't had a chance. I mean, they were in Europe, they were in England for 3 matchups in February this year. They could have just brought her to camp and have her train, even if they brought her in right before the Korea matchup to have her come in and train. And it is a little bit difficult in that sense to know if she wanted to, but we never really gave her an opportunity, right? We didn't give her an opportunity to reject us. We just never really turned to that, and that comes to the whole conversation of we have to look at how we're finding players and diversifying that, which to a degree is kind of why, like, as much as I love the idea, and don't get me wrong, we do need a domestic league for the women. There's also the thought in my head that says, but you've not shown diversification in choosing players. You've just taken players who are in the national development centers. Now, granted, the whole point of having an NDC is to get top players there so that you can coach them up to that level. There's no doubt about that. So in a sense, you're trying to accumulate all the talent together and then choose from that. But you're also not factoring the fact that development isn't linear. There was a study that's been going around on Twitter. I think it was looking at the national youth levels for the Spain national team. They were saying, the stat in it that really was surprising to me, but stuck with me, is that only 13 players who ultimately were there played youth, all youth levels from 15 all the way to senior level. So that's saying 13 of the players of a pool of about 113 players, or 130, I forget what the number is. 13 of them went from point A in youth development all the way to that. Now, the study itself is talking about, when you should maximize players. Maybe when they're a little bit older, you have a better view of it, which is an interesting factor, because if you look at some of the outstanding performers at U17s for men, for example, they are a little bit better at indicating solid players than, say, if you look at the U20s, right? And there's maybe a bit of a correlation in terms of players starting to maximize who they are players not able to make that next leap versus players being able to make that leap. But that being said, you had 13 players who played youth national teams. The rest of them all came in at different times, and it speaks to just the variety of game players. And now, granted, yes, Spain has leagues, Spain has different clubs who develop players, there's no doubt about. But in Canada, we have clubs who develop players. Why is it that our national teams are primarily, it's not even primarily, they feel like they're 90% national team? If you've played youth for in Canada on the women's side, odds are it feels like you're going to be playing for the senior team. Which, if that's a pathway, that's the pathway. But you're not really giving a pathway for for players who don't make it through that. And I think that's a bit problematic, because we reach a point where, yes, we see players who leave and play in other countries, and our system isn't perfect. I mean, we've seen with Stefan Mitrovic, where we couldn't identify the talent. Then Serbia, on the men's side, develops a player, and then once he reaches a level, then it becomes a conversation of, hey, let's try to get him into the fold now. Well, you've had plenty of other opportunities. If you're going to say the standards for communication or standards to be on the radar are these 3 things, that means you're going to leave some across the wayside, right? But I think it's frustrating for me. It's also frustrating for me because there's a degree where it's like, on the women's side, and they don't need to be this, right? On the women's side, it's, look, they're Canadian and they're playing. Look at them, they found an opportunity. And for me, I'm like, no, I want to be angry about this. I can live if a player, rejects me. I can live if a player rejects the federation. That's fine. But let me at least try to go on a date with a player. Or, this is a terrible example. Let me at least try to court the player, and if they say no, then that's fine. But without actually having them in to see the environment and then you're there, that hurts. That hurts because it's like, okay, if they're able to see it, there's no way that we are so shallow. Because, again, the other thing, which is a bit of an interesting misnomer, if you look at the caps on this latest roster, it's like they're either all plus 80 or all minus 20. There's a few 40s in there, like Jordan Heidema has 44. Julia Grosso is in the 40s as well. But for the most part, you either have lots of caps or few caps. And I think how we move forward, it can't just be on Bev, it has to be on the Federation in terms of creating opportunities to see not the top 26, but we'll say 27 to 50. Because to be able to see 27 to 50 matters, because we are reaching the point with this national team where there's going to be probably in the next 2 cycles, there's going to be a full revamp of this team, right? After this World Cup next year, you're probably going to lose, in my opinion, probably going to lose Scott, probably going to lose Sinclair, and then Sophie Schmidt is the conversation. And that's just basing it off of ages, because you don't know when that decline comes. That means your midfield is only going to be Grosso, Fleming, and Quinn. And who do you replace them with, right? Do you try to replace them with players who are like in that 26 to 50 range, 26 to 36 range, how as we perceive it? So like your Pickett's, Stratigatkis's, Ali Doos, players like that, or do you just look directly to your youth teams, as they have been doing, looking at a Simi Awuja who's playing collegiate, say, okay, it's your time, getting Zoe Barnes in there, going to your U17s if you need to, and being like, hey, you want to get Anna Hauer, Geneva, Hernandez Gray, players like that. Who do you turn to, and what do you allow yourself to do? I think you have to be able to use players, and that's another thing that I always think about. How many years of players are we missing out the best version of those players? And no, it's a lot to ask for, but you have to give those players those opportunities to go. And I think relying on such a close-knit group sometimes means you are cutting out a player who's playing at the top of their game, who maybe will never look as good as they do. And maybe that's fine, you want a higher level, but is a max version of one person worth maybe a less percentage version of another player? These are questions. Overall, I don't know. There's pros, there's cons, there's feelings. Overall, I just feel they need to do a better job at seeing the players, especially 26 to 50. However they rank them, and whether that's having camps specifically for that, which is why I was really a proponent of when they were going to go to Australia. I was a proponent of just take your North American based players to Australia, and then when you get to Europe against Morocco or Argentina, once it was announced, use primarily European based players there. That way you can see the depth and actually have to play the depth and see how they react. Because if not, you're going to be in a situation where you're 3 injuries away from players who you have to find out about, and then that leash gets a lot shorter, and that's not necessarily fair to them to get comfortable within the system and go. Bev's big on training, and we don't see that, so that is a fair point to bring up. But I just feel that we have to do a better job of seeing players 26, 23, 26 to 50, and getting those players integrated so that we don't have to go. I mean, some youth are exceptional and they will definitely fit in, but I think we have to do better, because I don't want to be the only person, and I don't want to just feel like, while I celebrate a player who's able to be picked to play for a national team, but maybe they feel more connected to than they do here. I'm a dual nat. I got my feelings, I got my emotions, my ties with Canada, and this is Ghana. And that's a tough choice that you have to make regardless. But I want us to be more into these conversations, more of these tugs for players and actually giving them a chance versus just losing a player that we never really gave an opportunity to, and then just having to send well wishes. Regardless, Kelsey, congratulations on the call-up. You definitely played your way to deserve it, and I'm looking forward to you, if you do play, looking forward to you to play like the player that we know you are. But from a Canada perspective, we just got to do better at seeing the players who aren't coming through the pipeline that we've created, because we have to diversify our own pipelines. It's very important for us. I don't know. What do you guys think? I'm going to stop rambling now.